Hello, Bible students. Welcome back to Love's Lessons and the Bible Study Guide, Lesson 12. I'm glad you're back. We're going to be finding out more about what happens with Joseph and his family down in Egypt. But before we do that, we're going to do some quick drills. These are going to be super simple. They're ones that we've already done, and it's just review. So let's go. Our first drill is to name the first 5 books of the New Testament. I bet you already know these. Can you name them? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Great job. Now, if you remember that how many divisions are in the New Testament? There are 4 major divisions. And remember what they are? Gospels, history, letters, and prophecy. And as you know, the Gospels are the first 4 books that we just named: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then our section of history just consists of the one book, which is Acts. Then it goes on to the letters that go all the way up until the book of prophecy, which is the last book, Revelation. Let's look at our cheat sheet. Okay, here's our little sheet that helps us to remember the divisions. We've got the Gospels that tell about the life and death of Jesus and his resurrection: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The one book of history is Acts. And then we've got all the letters. And if you remember, they're everything from Romans all the way to Jude. And then the one book of prophecy, which tells of the future events that are to come, Revelation. Good. If you remember the song, it makes it super simple. Let's go ahead and sing the song that goes with the New Testament books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, and the letter to the Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians and Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, First and Second Thessalonians, First and Second Timothy, Titus and Philemon, Hebrews, James, First and Second Peter, First and Second and Third John, Jude. And our book of prophecy, Revelation. Great job. And now we're going to play Who Am I? We've played this before, and I think you're going to be able to do this. I've got 3 people I'm going to tell you about. I'm going to give you clues. They're going to start easy, then it's going to get a little more difficult, and the last one might be considered hard. I don't know, but we'll see. I don't know how much you know, but even as we play this game, you're going to learn a lot. Okay, are you ready for your first character? I am a woman. It could be a lot of people, right? It could be Rachel. It could be Rebecca. It could be Sarah. It could be Mary. It could be Lot's wife. Okay. If you said any of those, you're not right. So, second clue. I am in the Old Testament. Okay, so it's not Mary, is it? It's not Martha. It's not Mary Magdalene. It's not any of those women in the New Testament. Next clue. I was the first mother. Did you get it? Okay, it's Eve. That's right. If you look up on our timeline, in the beginning, we have Adam and his wife Eve that God made as a helper for Adam from one of his ribs. Did you know that? Okay, Eve was formed from one of Adam's ribs, and she was the first woman and the first mother. Okay, I hope you got that one. Very good. All right, our next character. I am a man. I wish I knew what you were guessing, but I bet you didn't guess this one. So I'm going to give you another clue. I am in the Old Testament. So it wasn't Jesus, was it? It wasn't one of his apostles, was it? It wasn't Pilate. It wasn't Herod. It wasn't any of those guys. Wasn't any of the writers of the New Testament? No. Okay. So it's a man in the Old Testament. Did you say Moses or Joshua? Did you say King David? Did you say Isaiah? Did you say one of the other prophets? Okay, it's not one of those. Did you say Jacob or Joseph? It's not one of those. Okay, next clue. You can read about me in the book of Genesis. Okay, it's a man who's in Genesis. So you might have said Adam. Wasn't Adam. Did you say Noah? No, it wasn't him. Okay, we already said it wasn't Joseph or Jacob. Maybe it was Abraham or Isaac. No, let me give you another clue. I am one of Leah's sons. Okay, remember Leah was Jacob's wife. She was one of his four wives. So, do you remember her sons? Okay, we studied this way early on, maybe in lesson 2. Now we know that Jacob had 12 sons. How many sons were Leah's sons? 6. She had half of the sons. And then her handmaiden had 2, Rachel's handmaiden had 2, and Rachel had 2. So Leah had 6. Now we got to know who they are so we can guess who this guy is. Do you remember? Let's think about our song. They go in order of the mothers. So Leah's sons are the first 6 names in our song. Okay, well, now we can do it, right? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Those are Leah's sons. So we can guess one of those. Wonder which one. Okay, let me give you another clue so I can help you figure out which one it is. I was the son whose descendants would become the priests of Israel. Now, I don't know if you already knew that, but that will tell you who it is. If you don't already know, I'm going to tell you. Maybe you guessed it. I hope you did. Levi. Levi is the answer. Her son Levi would be the beginning of the lineage of the priests. And priests were those who would take care of God's house. In the Old Testament, God's house was either a tabernacle, which was a tent that could be moved around. Later, there was a temple. If you remember, David's son Solomon built a temple, which was a permanent house for God. And that's where the priests then were in charge of God's house. So Levi himself was not a priest because they didn't have priests then, but his descendants would become the priest of Israel. Okay, so Levi is the answer to that one. Okay, great job. I hope you're playing this at home with your family or your siblings. It's a really great game, and I hope you were able to get those. And if not, we'll get them next time. Great job. All right, here are our review questions. Our first one is from lesson 8. Jacob's sons refused to make a second trip to Egypt to get grain unless Jacob blank. They said, we can't go back unless you send Benjamin. That's right. Joseph had demanded, you can't come back here without your youngest brother. These questions are from lesson 9. Who followed the 11 brothers as they left for home with their purchased food? Okay, if you remember, Joseph had secretly had his steward put his special cup of divination into one of the sacks, Benjamin's sack. And so then he sent his steward after them so he could tell them to come back because somebody had taken his cup. Good job. Which brother asked Joseph to let himself be the slave instead of Benjamin? Okay, if you remember from this lesson, Judah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, had promised his father that he would bring the boy Benjamin, they call him a boy, he wasn't really that young, back safely. And so remember, he gave this long explanation to Joseph about why he needed to stay because he had guaranteed Benjamin's safety to his father Jacob. And so he said, please just keep me because I have guaranteed the boy's safety. He's got to go back home or my father will die of sorrow. These questions are from lesson 10. Who was with the brothers when Joseph revealed his identity? The answer is no one. Remember, he sent everyone out of the room, so it was just him and his brothers. Okay, good. So no one. What goods did Pharaoh tell the brothers to bring to Egypt when they moved? He said, "You don't need to bring anything. Just come down. We'll take care of you." And now, from last time's lesson, the number of direct descendants of Jacob traveling to Egypt were blank. If you remember, we put this up on our board last time, 66. 66 family members traveled from Canaan down to Egypt. Then the total number, including Joseph's family, was okay, it was Joseph. He had a wife and two sons. So that's 66 plus 4, 70. Great, 70. Really good. Every time we go over these, we're going to be putting those facts and those stories back into our brains and bringing them to our memory. So I'm glad that you're doing this with me. Great job. In our last lesson, 66 members of Joseph's family are going to move from Canaan to the land of Egypt, where Joseph is in control of all of Egypt, where there is grain, so they won't starve. So that's where we ended, was that his father, that he hadn't seen in over 20 years, Jacob, his beloved father, they had that special relationship, finally meet in the land of Goshen, the land where Pharaoh has said that they can settle because they're shepherds. And they finally are reunited after over 20 years. And Joseph previously has forgiven his brothers and said, "When you sold me, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And Joseph has seen why God did this and allowed this to happen, because the great famine throughout the entire world was going to be devastating for not only the world, but especially his family. And so he has been able, with God's help, to save his family from this famine and also the world. And so he's been able to see that all these crazy things that happened to him are for a good purpose, God's good will and his good purpose. And so he's forgiven his brothers. He's been reunited with his father. And now he says, now we need to go and present ourselves to Pharaoh and tell him that you are shepherds, so that he will be okay with you living in this land a little bit away from the rest of the Egyptians, because they feel like shepherds are detestable. And this would be a good land for you all to settle in. So that's where we're going to start today. So I hope you have your Bibles. If you don't, run get one real quick. You can pause and come back, and we're going to open up to Genesis chapter 47. Okay, let's open up to the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and we're going to go to chapter 47. So let's look and see 15, 18, 20, 22, 26, 30, 32, 40, 47. Here it is. Okay, I hope you're getting quicker at that. If you aren't, it's okay. Take your time. First book of the Bible is Genesis, and we're going to chapter 47. And these numbers at the top will help you know where you are. So let's start in verse 1. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers, with their flocks and herds and everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now, please let your servants settle in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. Okay, so Joseph goes to Pharaoh and says, my father and brothers have come. Pharaoh's not surprised because he has invited them to come, right? So they need to be presented before Pharaoh. Now, interestingly enough, Joseph did not bring all of his brothers. He only brought five, and it doesn't say which five, but we're going to put five up here. We're going to put Reuben, Judah, and a few others. Okay, so five of his brothers came and present themselves before Pharaoh. And remember what they said. They said, we are shepherds, just like Joseph told them to say. He needs to know this. We can't live right here amongst you all. We need to live in a land in Egypt, but maybe a little further away because we have lots of herds and we need pasture lands for them. Because remember what they said, we are here because the famine is severe in Canaan and we need pasture for our flocks. So, what does Pharaoh say? He says, he says to Joseph, give your brothers and your father and your family the best of the land of Goshen. Now, why would he say that? Well, that's easy. What has Joseph done for Pharaoh in Egypt? Saved them, literally saved them. They all would have starved. Egypt would have gone downhill. It would have been a mess. And Pharaoh knows this. So he says, this is your family. We're going to do the best for them because of what you and your God have done for me and my country. Okay. Then Joseph brings his father in to present him. So Joseph brings in his father Jacob, his old father Jacob, who's finally reunited with him, and presents him before Pharaoh. And he blesses Pharaoh. My Bible says that blessed may also mean greeted. So we're not sure exactly what that was, but he did greet him and maybe blessed him. Pharaoh asked him how old he was, and how old did he say he was? 130. That sounds like really old to us, doesn't it? But if we haven't talked about this, people back in those days lived longer generally than they do today. So even though he was 130, he says, my years do not equal the pilgrimage of my fathers. Now, who were his fathers? Abraham and Isaac, right? If you don't know, Abraham lived until he was 175 years old. And Isaac lived to be 180 years old. So that wasn't really all that unusual. So even though 130 sounds old, it's not near as old as 175 or 180. So back then, God allowed people to live a little bit longer than he does today. So at this point, Jacob is 130 years old. And then again, it says Jacob blessed Pharaoh, which could have just meant said farewell to Pharaoh and went out from his presence. And then Joseph settled his brothers in the best part of Egypt in the property in the district of Ramses, or the area known as Goshen. And we're going to find that on our map a little bit later. Joseph also provided his father and brother and all his father's household with food according to how many of our children they had. And we know there were 66 that came down total. So he gave them provisions to get started because they had just moved and they didn't have anything in place. So he's given them everything they need. Let's start reading in verse 13. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is used up. We know that this famine is going to go on for 7 years. So a famine means there's nothing growing. There's no new food. There's no grass. There's nothing. How do we keep these flocks alive? How do we keep ourselves alive when there is nothing to eat? So it's just getting worse and worse because slowly everything has wasted and withered away. And that's scary. So as we see, the famine is getting more and more deep and dangerous, right? So Joseph has collected this money because the people are coming. Remember, just like we've said before, his own brothers came to buy food. Well, eventually, you've spent all your money. You don't have any more money because you're not making any money because you can't grow anything. You can't feed your flocks. You can't sell your flocks. You can't not it's not working. Your flocks are dying from lack of food. So they have gone through all of their money now, and this is getting very serious. So they come to Joseph. All of Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die? Our money is used up." So they're basically pleading with Joseph. We've given you all our money. We don't have any more money. And now we need more food again because all the food we bought already has been used and we're going to starve. So what happens next? There's a temporary solution. So let's go back to verse 16. Then bring your livestock, said Joseph. I will sell you food in exchange for your livestock since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goats, their cattle and donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for all their livestock. So the famine is going, going, going. We don't know how far into it we are, probably a few years, but we know it's going to be 7. So the Egyptians, they've got to have grain. So what do they bring first to get grain? They bring their money. Right. They have money. So at this point, at the beginning of the famine, remember there's been 7 years of plenty. So they were doing really well. So they probably were more wealthy than they normally would have been, which is great. But eventually, this famine doesn't end and they have run out of money. So what does the Bible say? They came and pleaded with Joseph, "What can we do? Our money is gone." And what did he say? He said, "Give me your livestock." Okay, what is livestock? It tells us right here in the Bible. It says they brought their horses, their sheep, their goats, their cattle, and their donkeys. Okay, they have this, which is like money, uh, and Joseph has said he'll accept it. He will take their animals as money for grain. So they begin bringing their livestock to him in exchange for money so they can just stay alive. Okay, so far they've used up all their money and now they're using up their livestock. So let's go back to the Bible. Verse 18. When that year was over, they came to him the following year and said, "We cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there is nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes? We and our land as well. Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." This is just getting worse and worse. So now what is the only thing they have left? Themselves, their own bodies, and their land. That's what they have left. And we're going to put that in red because that's really sad, isn't it? But what does that mean? They're going to give him their bodies. Well, we know what land is. So if you own property, if you own a piece of land, you can give that to somebody in exchange for money or food, right? So they can get that. But what does it mean to give your body? That means They are now going to be Pharaoh's slaves. They will work for food. They will be Pharaoh's slaves just so they can stay alive and not starve. Okay, this is how bad. God said it would be really bad. Remember what God said? He said the 7 years of plenty are going to be so much you can't even count the grain. But the 7 years of famine will be so bad that all of those 7 years of plenty will be forgotten. Do you think about now they're forgetting the 7 years of plenty? They're destitute. They're desperate. Okay, I think they're forgetting because they have nothing. Let's go back and see what happens. Verse 20. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. However, he did not buy the land of the priests because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land. So first they sell their land. So they owned their own land before this. They were just Pharaoh was, like we said, their king, and that doesn't mean, that kings own the land. The people owned the land. But at this point, that's all they had left. They had no money, they had no livestock, they had nothing to give in exchange for the food they needed. So they sold all their land to Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh owns the entire land of Egypt. He owns it all himself. And now that they have no land, what's next? Themselves. So now they are slaves to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh will feed them in exchange for work that they do. So Pharaoh will give them work to do, jobs to do. They will work for Pharaoh. And in exchange, they won't get money, they'll get food, right? That's what they need to stay alive. This was the only solution. That's all they had left. And so this is the predicament that they're in. Okay, who did not have to sell their land? Do you remember what the Bible said? Not the priests. Okay, we sort of talked about priests in our drill a few minutes ago. So, priests were the ones who were in charge of making sure that all the things that their gods needed, the sacrifices that they needed from the people, were done. The reason that they didn't need to sell their land and their bodies is because it says Pharaoh gave them a regular allotment. He would regularly give them seed or food or whatever it was that they needed. I doubt if it was money, it was probably seed so they could plant their crops. And they had pasture land, so they probably had sheep. So they got something from Pharaoh automatically. They didn't have to buy it for the job that they did, right? They got to remain in the same state they had been in as the priest, and they had what they needed. Let's start reading in verse 23. Joseph said to the people, now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed for you so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children. You have saved our lives, they said. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priest that did not become Pharaoh's. So how is this going to work? All right. So because they had agreed that they would be in bondage or in servitude to Pharaoh, Joseph gave them grain so that they could plant and have a harvest. Now, the land did belong to him, so how was that supposed to work? They were going to plant the seed on Pharaoh's land. So what happened was when they planted their seed and they harvested their crops, okay, these are grain sacks. If you can't tell what they are, they're grain sacks. Okay, so let's give ourselves 5 grain sacks. Okay, there's 4. We need one more. Do we have room? Okay. Okay. So let's pretend all these are equal. All right. So when they harvested their crops, their grain, They would have to give, let's say these are 5 equal bags. Let's say this is all of their crops. It may or may not have been. They would have to give one of them to Pharaoh. So 1/5. So if you know math, you might be a good mathematician. I don't know. Then each one of these is 1/5. Okay. So if each one is 1/5, we can add them up. 1/5 plus 1/5 is 2/5, plus 1/5 is 3/5, plus 1/5 is 4/5, plus 1/5 is 5/5, and that means all of it, right? 5/5 is one, so that's all their grain. So when they did that, they would have to give 1/5 would go to who? Pharaoh. They didn't get to keep this part. They had to give it to Pharaoh. That's because the land belonged to Pharaoh, right? So he gave them seed, they planted it, and when it was harvested, they give 1/5 to him. And then they got to keep 4/5, right? Okay, so that was the deal. I think that was a pretty good deal for them because they really had no choice. They had to do whatever Joseph and Pharaoh came up with. And this is not a bad plan, honestly. They got to keep 4 of the 5ths and give one to Pharaoh. Still a lot, but at least they weren't going to starve, right? Okay, in verse 26, if you notice something, it says that this law of the 1/5 goes to Pharaoh uh, concerning the land of Egypt was still in force today. Now, does that mean today? Does that mean 2023, 24? No, that's not 2024. That is when this was written. And when this part of Genesis was written, that was still in force. Okay, it's not in force now. No. So when you see things like that, it says, and still today, that means when that book was written, that was still the law then. It's not the law now, just so you know. And the land of the priests was the only land that did not belong to Pharaoh. Verse 27. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. This is Joseph's family. They settled in Goshen. They acquired property, so they have their own property, and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Okay, so God is still blessing his people. Now, he did save the Egyptians, yes, but are they his special chosen people? No. So it looks like the Israelites have it even a little bit better than just the regular folks, right? They got the best land, which Pharaoh himself said was the best part of Egypt, Goshen. They acquired property there, so it sounds like they own their own property and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So they're having children and they're getting along really well. We're not surprised, are we? Okay, let's go to verse 28. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, you know, Israel is the name of Jacob, right? He called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. I will do as you say, he said. Swear to me, he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So Jacob lives in Egypt or the land of Goshen for 17 years. He lives to be 147, not as old as Abraham and Isaac, but still a long time, right? But he has one request. When he's old and he's about to die, he calls Joseph and says, you have to promise me something. And what was it? What was the promise? Don't bury me in this foreign land. Where does he want to be buried? Back in the promised land of Canaan, where Abraham and Isaac and his mothers and grandmothers are buried as well. So he wants Joseph to make sure that his body is carried back to the land of Canaan to be buried, not buried in Egypt. And did Joseph say he would do that? Yes, he did. He swore that he would do that, and Israel worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So it sounds like the end of Jacob's life was really pleasant. He got to be with his favorite son and all of his children, and they did not starve from the famine because God used Joseph to save them all. And they prospered and they were numerous and they had property and things went really well for them. So that is a really great ending for Jacob after he went through so much turmoil, losing his favorite wife, losing his favorite son for many years, over 20 years, and being in a famine where he didn't know where they were going to get food or how they were going to survive, to this, where he got to spend 17 years with his entire family, 70 when they got down there, but it says they increased greatly. So I'm sure there were at least 100, 200, 300 people by 17 years after that. So Jacob dies a happy man, but his one request was to go back to the land of Canaan. And Joseph promises that. Now, next time, the story's not quite over. We're going to get a little more detail about some things that happen before Jacob dies that are going to be important to the family. So the story's not over yet, but this does have a happy ending, and we'll get some more details next time. First question. Pharaoh said Joseph's family could have the A, poorest land, B, best land, or C, mediocre land of Egypt. The best land, that's right. What did Jacob do when he met Pharaoh? Remember, the Bible says he blessed him, but that could also mean that he greeted him. But he showed him respect. Either way, he showed him respect and paid him respect for the position that he had as ruler of Egypt. How old was Jacob when he moved to Egypt? He told Pharaoh he was 130 years old. How old was Jacob when he died? 147. Right. He lived 130 years in Canaan or around Canaan, and he also lived 17 years in Egypt, so 147. When the people of Egypt and Canaan had spent all their money for food, what did Joseph ask for payment? Okay, remember up on the board, we listed the things that they had to give Joseph to pay for food. First, they spent all their money. So what was number 2? Their livestock. And it even told us what that meant. So let's look and see. Chapter 47, verse 17. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goats, their cattle and donkeys, all their livestock. After the people of Egypt had given all their money and all their livestock in exchange for food, what did they then offer? All right, this was number 3. They gave money, then their livestock, and then what? It's 2 things: their land and their bodies, their land and their own bodies to work for him as slaves. What request of Joseph did Jacob make before his death? What was Jacob's one request that Joseph do for him after he died? He did not want to be buried in Egypt. Where did he want to be buried? In the land of Canaan, where he was from, the promised land that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wanted to be buried with his fathers in the land of Canaan. Acts is a book in the division of A, prophecy, B, history, C, letters, or D, gospels. History, you know that. B, history. That's right. Good job. All right, we need to find a couple of places on our map that we've already labeled, and then we're going to add one more place. So we have been talking about this story, and in today's story, Jacob and all of his sons have come to live in Goshen, and the Pharaoh has approved that they will live there so that they can live there with their flocks since they are shepherds. And Pharaoh even calls this the best land in Egypt. So we already have it labeled. So we know where Egypt is, right? I hope you know. Let's find Egypt first. All right, we got the Mediterranean Sea. Then we have the country, the land of Egypt, and it is labeled right here. It's in green. So each one of these things is labeled a different color. Bodies of water are in blue, and then a country or a land area is in green, such as Egypt. And then we were going to find Goshen. It's not a city, it is also an area within Egypt. And here we labeled it, I believe, last time, and it is Goshen. Now I looked it up. I think I had put it up a little higher. Um, what I read was that it's a little bit closer to Canaan. Okay, so maybe not all this area over here, maybe this area, but mostly on this side of the Nile where they would have been coming from Canaan, and this is the land of Goshen. Well watered, it looks like, plenty of pasture land for their sheep. Okay, so what else do we need to find? Let's go ahead and find Canaan. It's also a country or a land area, and it's up here, as we said. They had to travel from Canaan to Goshen. So probably Pharaoh lived a little bit further up the Nile. Actually, they called this Upper Egypt, and down here was Lower Egypt, and that seems backwards because when we look at a map, we think of this as being up and this as being down. But the reason for that was that the Nile River flowed this way and emptied into the Mediterranean. So they called this section of Egypt down here Upper Egypt, and then this section would be Lower Egypt. So that's just a little fact for you. So here's Goshen. Now, Joseph settled his father and his brothers, this is in verse 11, in the district of Ramses. Okay, Ramses, you may have heard that before. It's the name of some people, some ancient people, possibly some of the pharaohs, and also the name of a place. And this will be, like I said, in red. And that shows a smaller area, usually a city, or it's called in this passage the district. So a district is smaller than an area such as Goshen or a country like Egypt. So Ramses would have been somewhere about right here. And that is where the Bible says he settled Jacob and his brothers as the best part of Egypt. So Ramses is our first district or city that we've got on our map. And now you know where exactly they settled in the land of Egypt. If you will look at verse 29, you may have noticed something seems a little strange. It says, when the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. Why did Jacob ask Joseph to put his hand under his thigh and make this oath? Well, back then, there wasn't a lot of written words. They didn't really use paper. They didn't print everything out. Today, we can just type on our computer and say print, and it'll print it on our printer, and boom, we have a written document, right? We've got whatever we want, and somebody can sign it. If we make an agreement with somebody, we just type that out, we all sign it, we give each other copies because a copy is easy to do. Just press it again and we'll have 2 copies or 10 copies or 15 copies. Well, back in 1900 BC, they didn't have these things. So how would they make an agreement if they didn't have a contract? Today, a lot of times, if you have a legal contract, you still have to sign or put your signature on either a paper copy or an electronic copy of an agreement that's been written up, and everybody knows what the agreement is and they know the rules. And so if something bad goes wrong, we can go back and look and say, oh, you're supposed to do this because we both agreed to it. See, here are our signatures and this is what it says. Well, that's not how it worked back then. They didn't write a lot of things down. So what did they do? They made an oath, which just means they gave their word. They promised to do something. So when they did that, one of the things to show that this was an important promise or oath was that One party would put their hand under the thigh of the party requesting something. So here we've got Jacob requesting of Joseph, please don't bury me in Egypt. Take me back to the promised land of Canaan. So this was just kind of symbolic. This is how they would do things back then. We don't do that today, but that's because things have changed and we don't need to. We've got it all written out. So this was just a way of saying this is an important oath that we're making. And a man's word or his promise was very important. So if a man gave his word that he would do something, he did it. Now, if he didn't do it, what would happen? Well, guess what? People wouldn't trust him anymore. People wouldn't do business with him anymore. People wouldn't help him when he got in trouble maybe anymore. People wouldn't get into agreements that would help each other anymore because they couldn't trust the man. If a man said he would do something, he didn't do it, no one could trust him. So nobody wanted to work with him. Nobody wanted to uh, give him the benefit of the doubt or give him grace when he needed a grace period if he couldn't get things done when he needed to. And sometimes those things happen. But if you didn't have a good reputation that your word was going to be true and you were truthful, then you were going to have a pretty hard life because we all depend on other people to live. And if other people couldn't count on you or trust you and they wouldn't make agreements or help you out, then you were going to be in a lot of need. So this is just a way that in ancient times or in 1900 BC, they would make an oath, which meant, I promise I will do this for you, or I'm making an agreement about thus and so with you, and it's going to happen. I will follow through. In today's lesson, Jacob and Joseph made an oath. They agreed that Joseph would not bury Jacob in Egypt. He would take him back to his homeland of Canaan and bury him with his fathers who were buried in the cave of Machpelah with their wives. So this was the oath that was made. I wanted to talk to you all today about your word. We talked a little bit about how a man's word was very important. If you kept your word and you were truthful, that was very important. And it's still important today that people can trust you and that you tell the truth. God expects us to tell the truth. He has nothing to do with lies. Satan is the father of lies, and we don't want to be anything like him. So I want us to use our Bibles to look up a passage that relates to what we say and what we agree to do. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. So if you remember, Matthew is the first book of the New Testament, right? So we can get our Bible and we can pass all the Old Testament, right? And try to get to the New Testament, which is probably about right there. Oh, I'm in Mark. So I went just a little bit too far because Matthew, Mark, right? So I got to go backwards and we're going to go to Matthew chapter 5. So we're going to go down from 24, 13, 11, 6, 5, and verse 33. So I've got to turn back one more page. Okay, here it is. Hope you found it. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So in Matthew, this is Jesus speaking, and he's preaching to the people. And he says, when you make an oath, you need to keep that oath or promise that you make. And you don't need to swear by heaven or earth. You don't need to swear by Jerusalem. You don't need to swear by your head. You can't make even one hair white or black. So don't be swearing by this or that. Just let your yes be yes and your no, no. In other words, if you say you're going to do something, then do it. If you agree or make an agreement with someone, then make sure you are going to keep that agreement. If you say no, make sure that you don't do whatever you said you won't do. Don't have to make people wonder whether you're going to keep your promise or not. And don't swear and make these oaths on this or that or the other that you can't even control. All you can control is you, and if you keep your oath or promise. So I think this is really good for us to remember that we need to be careful about the things we say that we're going to do or not do, or agreements we get into, because we need to make sure that we keep those agreements and that people can trust us. And I think it's very interesting that he says in this verse in Matthew, anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Like we just said, Satan is the father of lies, and Satan is the father of deception, and Satan is the father of not doing what you say you're going to do, right? Or doing something you shouldn't do, said you wouldn't do. So we don't want to have anything to do with that. So that is something about keeping your word and making sure that your word is something that people can trust. Will you pray with me? Dear Father in heaven, thank you again for this lesson from your word. Thank you that we can read it together and study it and learn. And thank you that we can see you working in the lives of Jacob and Joseph and his brothers and Pharaoh and the Egyptians and all the people involved. Thank you that Joseph was there and that he let you use him to save the people, even though things got really, really bad in the 7 years of famine. Thank you that he was there with the grain that they needed and provided so that they would not starve. Thank you that we know and can count on you to keep your promises, that your yes is always yes and your no is always no, and that you love us and want us to live with you in eternity. And we can count on that, and that we can always, no matter where we are, worship and praise you and pray to you and thank you and give you glory and praise for all that you are and all that you do for us, and that we can just tell you our problems, give them to you, and know that you care and that you have it all worked out, even though we may not understand what's happening or why we're going through things or why things are good or why things are bad or why we're confused. If we will just count on you, then we can have peace because we know you're in control and you want us to live with you in heaven with you and your son Jesus through eternity. Thank you so much for being who you are. Thank you for your son Jesus and for who he is and for the example he gave to us and the words that he gave us when he was here. Help us every day to live and be better people for you. We glorify you and praise you and thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for being with me today.